they justify people's worst fears. When the law was introduced, it clearly had the potential to be used very widely against a lot of people. Some people at the time said, no, look, don't worry about it. They're only going to use it, say, against people who try to declare Hong Kong's independence from Hong Kong, the most extreme kind of activists.
Mm.
But this group of 47 people who went on trial, include lawyers, former elected politicians, activist students, a nurse, a journalist. They're not at the extreme end of Hong Kong politics. Many of them are really in the mainstream of the kind of democratic movement in Hong Kong. So, this goes to show that even for people like that, the situation in Hong Kong really is very
Mm.
serious and very difficult indeed.
A court in Hong Kong has found 14 democracy activists guilty of subversion. Another two were acquitted. This is the biggest national security case in the island's history. Richard Lloyd Parry is the Times' Asia editor and can brief us on what's happened. Morning, Richard.
Hello.
These 14, what exactly are they accused of?
They're accused of the crime of subversion under this new national security law. Uh, this relates to events a few years ago when this group of activists tried to organize what were described as primaries. So they were a vote to select candidates for upcoming elections in Hong Kong. Now, that one might think is just what democracy is about and what's the harm in it. But what they were charged for was an alleged scheme, as the prosecutors called it, a scheme, which meant that having gained seats in Hong Kong's legislature, they would then block budgets, they would block legislation, and they would attempt to force the resignation of Hong Kong's chief executive, who was appointed essentially by the Chinese Communist government in Beijing. So the defense lawyers said, well, this is just politics. This is what people do in a democracy when they're elected. They try and make it difficult for the government if they're in the opposition. But the judges agreed with the prosecutors that this was more than that. This was subversion. And so two of them were acquitted,
Mm.
14 convicted, and 31 others have pleaded
Do we
guilty.
know? Do we know why two of them were acquitted?
Yes, I mean, the judges talked a bit about that. It's to do with the detail of their cases. There was examination of statements that some of these accused people had made on Facebook and so on.
Mm.
And essentially, these two, a lawyer and an activist, the judges said, well, we're not clear that they were fully with the so-called scheme.
Mm.
They may have had some doubts about it. We can't be sure.
And as you mentioned, this decision overnight our time is relating to these 16 who entered not guilty pleas. But as you mentioned, there were some who did enter guilty pleas. I mean, why was that?
Yeah, 31 of them did plead guilty. I think almost all of those don't believe they're guilty or that they broke the law, but they've made the decision to do this because they hope that they'll get lighter sentences. So it's simply that if you plead guilty, you're more likely to get a shorter sentence. And I suppose some of them would say, well, if I do that, I'll be able to rejoin the fray more quickly than if I
Mm.
have to do time.
People remember the immense amount of concern that there was when this national security law was imposed by Beijing back in 2020. We've obviously had this case. How else has it been applied? I mean, have people's fears come true?
Yeah, I think the point about these arrests and these prosecutions is that in some ways they justify people's worst fears. When the law was introduced, it clearly had the potential to be used very widely against a lot of people. Some people at the time said, no, look, don't worry about it. They're only going to use it, say, against people who try to declare Hong Kong's independence from Hong Kong, the most extreme kind of activists.
Mm.
But this group of 47 people who went on trial, include lawyers, former elected politicians, activist students, a nurse, a journalist. They're not at the extreme end of Hong Kong politics. Many of them are really in the mainstream of the kind of democratic movement in Hong Kong. So, this goes to show that even for people like that, the situation in Hong Kong really is very serious and very difficult indeed.
Well, what exists of the democratic movement there now? I mean, there was one point where we had all those umbrella protests, but now what?
Yeah, I mean, all of that is completely unthinkable now. A lot of those organizations have disbanded because they fear that simply, having an organization could lay yourself open to charges. I mean, in a few days on June the 4th, it's the anniversary of the Tiananmen massacre in 1989, which of course everyone remembers. And that was always a very big day in Hong Kong, where people came out in mass, candlelit demonstrations of sympathy with those who died and implicit opposition to the Chinese government. There'll be absolutely nothing. I mean, I think even lighting a candle in public on that day could get you arrested in Hong Kong now.
So really, is there much difference? I mean, if you are someone liberally minded, maybe wants to protest or sort of lightly demonstrate against the government, is there any difference for you if you're in Hong Kong or in Beijing, or is it the same now?
No, there is a difference. You can get away with more in Hong Kong than you could on the mainland, but that is changing and the gap is rapidly closing. I mean, in education, schools, for example, Hong Kong schools always had a very good reputation for the sort of independent mindedness that they imparted to students. It was quite a broad curriculum. Now, all of that, certainly in the teaching history and current affairs, is being replaced by, essentially content approved by the mainland government of China that you wouldn't be far off describing as propaganda.
And just finally, Richard, what is this doing to Hong Kong? I mean, such a vibrant, important business centre. I mean, is this having an impact on the extent to which people want to go there and do business there?
I think it is. I mean, of course, there was the pandemic as well, which drove a lot of people, certainly expatriates, out of Hong Kong. I mean, it's not completely desolate. A lot of people have come back, and business still goes on there. It's still a very big financial centre, of course, but it's less important than it once was within China. I mean, when Hong Kong was handed over to China, of course, what people famously used to say was, "Don't worry, they're not going to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs." But now there are lots of geese all over China laying golden eggs, lots of these big cities,
Yeah.
with thriving industry and commerce. So Hong Kong's matters less to them than it used to.
Just finally, before we do leave you, Richard, what about sentencing in this case? When is that going to happen, and what might these guilty people now expect?
Yes, sentencing will be another day. Can't remember exactly when. I think it's going to be a few weeks. The maximum sentence they face is life in prison for subversion. I expect most of them won't get life in prison, but long prison sentences are in prospect.
Richard, thank you for that. That's Richard Lloyd Parry, the Times' agent editor. More on him, of course, from him at thetimes.co.uk if you're a subscriber.